We'll have this session in the form of panel discussion. So each of the four presenters will make 10 to 15 minute presentation, followed by debate among the four presenters, and also questions that will be answered by these four gentlemen. My name is Chow at Seoul National University, and in order to facilitate this session in an effective way, I'd like to make some summary of what has been done in the education policy in Korea and what should be the proper policy in the future. As we all know, in the human resources and education policy in Korea, there are many important issues, but one salient one would be between the two contrasting views on the education policy. I believe that in this world there are two contrasting views. One is oscillation, the other is convergence. Well, oscillation means that there are two different worlds, and we just oscillate between the two. The convergence model is that we have a certain truth, or the eternity, and we are always trying to move forward to that eternity. Well, if we take the oscillation view, then we can have two contrasting policies that have been in existence in the Korean education policy. Well, in the past, we had a very steep hierarchical order of the universities, high schools, and even middle schools in the old days. And only the top students or fortunate students would get the big pies, while those who are unfortunate would not have given proper opportunities in society. But then, in more recent years, we have moved to a more egalitarian policy in education, where everybody in our society should be given the equal opportunities. And certainly in each of these two models, there are pros and cons. And now our society is more or less split between these two models, and we are debating which model should be the one in the future. It is indeed one of the major issues even among the major candidates in the presidential election. But then there is another model. There is a convergence model. Well, in the 1960s, in this human resources field, what we were known in those days was in the name of personnel management. That meant that any organization, whether company, government, or any other organization in society, should employ people who have the proper capability. And then within the organization, these people would be managed. But then in the 1970s and 80s, this personal management was changed to human resources management, where training and education of people or employees are given more importance, and the organizations would employ people, and then with proper training and education make them competent in their job. And then in the 1990s, this human resources management was again changed to human capital management, where human resources is now given the role of creating value of the organization. And then we are now in the 21st century, and what will be a new form of human resources management, whether it will be continuation of this human capital management or whether we should have another different form, which is more futuristic in nature. So with these two types of models in mind, we'd like to discuss the future education policy of Korea together with other issues by these four business leaders, Mr. Ben Verwaayen, Richard Lyons, Franz Cremer, and Fong. It so happens that each of these four gentlemen represents four corners of business society. Ben represents telecommunication, Richard represents finance, Franz represents manufacturing, and Mr. Chow represents the infrastructure. So we'll have these four presentations, and then we'll have lively debate. May I introduce Mr. Ben Verwaayen of British Telecom.
Good morning, and I have to say it is fantastic to at the conference where the words global and HR are used in one sentence, because for a long time it is true that we had the personnel department, and basically we had management that dealt with the admin side of people, and line management was supposed to run the people organization. And then globalization happened, and something very profound happened as well. So let me talk about globalization for a few seconds, because I think this is the most important change that we witness, just from a geographical perspective, as from an individual perspective, as from an organizational perspective. Globalization 1.0 was best illustrated by looking at Starbucks in the Forbidden City. You took one culture and just implemented the product or the service right into another one. And you have many good examples of globalization with a Korean background. Look to your brands. They have done a fantastic job on the back of the products, on the quality of the products. All of a sudden, what was a regional product became a global product, meaning you could buy it anywhere in the world. That's globalization 1.0. But the world moved on. Something dramatic happened. And the dramatic change is that you can be an individual expert, a talent, and you can work with anybody in the world without changing home. 3, 4, 5 years ago, the world changed profoundly because talent no longer needed to have a passport, no longer needed to have a location to be recognized. You could be anywhere in the world, stay home, and participate without any hesitation. You can participate seamlessly with everybody else. That connectivity opened the door for whole new industries, like the IT outsourcing industry, like the development of countries like India. But more important, it opened the eyes of organizations around talent. And the battle changed, in my view, from product to talent. Because what is the differentiation today to be global? Well, first of all, let's define global in a service perspective. Because the chairman said we were all representing different type of industries. Well, we have one thing in common. For all our customers, whatever we do, at the end of the day, it's a service experience that counts. Whether you are in cars, traveling the airport, doing financial services, or trying to collaborate or communicate with somebody around the globe. The service aspect at the end of the day will be the differentiator. And the ability to make that happen will rely very firmly on the ability to find the right talent around the globe. And you need to have talent that recognizes two things. First of all, that there is a universal feeling of quality and capability, and that's truly global. You want to compare one product with the other, and you want to know which one is the best. But when it comes to service and face-to-face, it's very local. It's respect for culture, it's the capability to understand the translation of that what is global into that what is experienced on the local ground. And today, here in Seoul, this is local. And Singapore and London is global. Now I was yesterday in Singapore, when Seoul was global and Singapore was local. And my office is in London, so then London is very local, and this is global. It depends where you sit. And therefore, from a humanistic point of view, global is nothing else than a multiple of locals very much aligned with respect for culture and capability, but at the same time the understanding of a global cost profile and a global product performance. Now, what is the difference that you can make as a society? I think there are two. First one is education, because this will be the battle for talent. If I can get the talent wherever they are, and don't need them to have a local presence with my other colleagues in order to make a seamless process, we will go and hunt for the talent wherever they are in the world. And therefore there is a competitive landscape between nations and between individuals to develop talent. Now my colleague here will describe much better than I can the development of talent. But let me say a few words about the availability of talent. 20 years ago, if you were not born in the West, you had a huge disadvantage. Why? You couldn't get access to the best schools. Today, you can be wherever you are in the world to find access to best schools, because I think best is redefined. And schools is redefined. It's the ability for individuals to learn and to have the ability to learn further when they see new experience. And therefore, any society that wants to take full advantage to turn a threat into an opportunity, in my view, should very, very deeply invest in two aspects of education. The first education is learn how to learn. Not just learn to know, learn how to learn, because it will be a lifetime experience. And the second is learn how to be out of your comfort zone. If I look to Korea, one of the big challenges that you will have is that the success of your culture, the success of your organizations, will be a hinder to create an opening outside the comfort zone. Well, that is needed in order to be successful. And the second thing is diversity. If you want to have the best ideas, whatever the culture is, however successful you are, you need to break the mold and have the conflict inside and not outside. So different viewpoints, different backgrounds, different cultural experiences, men and women, from whatever ethnic background, whatever education, bringing together will produce better results and a better acceptance of the results than a monolithical culture, however successful that may be. And that is painful, because at the end of the day, the comfort zone is what brought us the results that we have today. Therefore, large organizations, successful organizations, in my view, have a big, big obstacle. Their own success very often is the hinder for future success. And the same is for countries. And therefore, in my view, the biggest challenge in global HR is the ability to bring agility, change, and constant diversity into the landscape. Thank you very much.
Well, it's an honor to get a chance to address you. I appreciate the invitation in being here. I'm going to speak a bit about innovation and organizational culture, something that certainly touches on what Ben just talked about. When we think about what firms compete on at the end of the day, do we compete on price? Do we compete on quality? I'm hearing from more and more firms in more and more industries that at the end of the day now, and even more so going forward, we compete on innovation. By innovation, let me define it. I define innovation as fresh thinking that creates value. It can't create value unless it's implemented, so it must be implemented, but it can't just be implemented. It has to be valued. And when we think a little bit about what that means for our organizations, I think most of us come from organizations where the senior team will talk about innovation. We need to be fresher, faster, more agile. We need to create value. You create value by being not the same as other people, but by being different, by being purposefully different. That's not easy. Let me start my talk here with a quick example. It's a quick exercise. And I don't have a lot of time, so I'll debrief it very quickly. But the exercise is a 1-minute exercise. I would like all of you to take 1 minute and to think about this. You have a cake, you have a knife, you can make 4 straight cuts in the cake. What's the largest number of pieces you can get out of that cake? Take 1 minute to think about that exercise. 4 cuts, straight cuts. Okay, let's talk about it very briefly, because time is tight. I won't ask you how many you got. If you cut the cake, if you thought about a round cake and you cut it 4 slices around the middle, you'd get 8 if you did that, where all of those cuts intersect at the same point. There are ways to get more than 8, and they often involve moving outside of the boundaries, the assumptions that our mind makes in the cake. Let me just talk about 3 assumptions that you probably made at least one of these 3 assumptions. Assumption number 1, you can't move the pieces around when you're cutting it. If you cut it and you move the pieces around, you can get a lot more pieces at the end. Assumption number 2, most of us cut through the top of the cake. If you cut through the side of the cake, most solutions will generate more pieces. And the third one, I do this with some of my kids and their friends. The third one is the kind of solution that a child finds that we don't. You ask a child the same thing, and you tell him or her, you know, you're not going to get more than 10 or 12 or 16. 16 is one that many of you may have arrived at. And the child might say, but my cake was in the shape of a caterpillar with 42 legs. And I got 42 with the first cut, 42 more with the second cut. The point here is when you hear and see people like me standing up here and saying, think outside the box, be cautious. We don't know where our boxes are. We don't know where the assumptions are. That's not the way you create innovative organizations, telling people to think outside the box. How do you create innovative organizations? Well, there are a lot of techniques, but ultimately we have to get into the ecosystem of what the organization is and think a little bit about organizational culture, among other things. A second point. There are really 3 points that I want to make, and then I'll sit down. Point 1 was that exercise. Thinking outside the box requires you to know where your box is. Point 2 is that innovation involves many, many different categories. If somebody says, I want my organization to be better at innovation, let's be clear about exactly what you're talking about. Are you talking about physical products? Are you talking about services, where interestingly, behavior is the product? Are you talking about technology? Are you talking about strategic innovation, organizational innovation, business model innovation? At Goldman Sachs, roughly 140 years of history, there is no way you could find another 5-year period in those 140 years where the business model, the way this firm makes money, has changed more than in the last 5. So how does that all result? This is the third point that I'd like to make. And I think at the end of the day, organizational culture is absolutely fundamental. And by organizational culture, you've all heard people talk about, well, get your people to take more risks. If people make mistakes, if they're sensible mistakes, don't punish them. And we hear a lot about ways of thinking about making sure people have the freedom to experiment and learn. And those are all good ideas. But cultural elements, in my judgment, that really produce innovation are one level up from that. And let me give you an example. I'll give you 3 examples. All 3 of these examples come from a set of panel discussions that we do with our managing director outside hires. So when we hire somebody at the managing director level, that's roughly 5% of the organization. These are people that usually come from firms in our industry, typically in the same geographic region. They know the industry well, and they come into the firm, and they have sometimes challenges integrating. So we put panels together with people that came to the firm 3 to 5 years before, but integrated very successfully, and we discuss what feels different. That's a very true measure of culture. When somebody comes in from a firm, by all intents and purposes, it looks exactly the same as Goldman Sachs and says, boy, does this feel different. That's a cultural attribute you want to pay attention to. And there are 3 of those that might not even come up in most discussions of innovation that we hear from every one of these people that's trying to integrate to Goldman Sachs. Number 1, what we would call our posting culture. People say, I got here and I'm getting a flurry of voicemails. People providing me information that may be useful to my role. And my wrists get slapped in those first 6 months because people tell me, hey, I should have known that, and you should have let that information flow to me. Now, in our industry, there are lots of reasons why information cannot flow. And I'm not talking about information flows across the kinds of barriers that regulations will not allow it to flow. A firm like ours and the firms we compete with wouldn't think about allowing that to happen. Does information flow where it can flow? Is information fluid? When you enter a firm and you're not of that firm, does it feel like, my gosh, there's a lot more information flying around here? That is very important for innovation. Number 2, people come to the firm and they say, gosh, it's a hard place to get to know. I can't see organization charts on the internal intranet. How do I get to know the place? It is harder. But it's exactly that flatness. When we say, what does flatness really mean? Flatness has some costs to it. It makes the place feel bigger than it is. It makes it harder for people to be able to get to know it. But when it's flat, and it's really flat, and people are living it flat, you can combine and recombine resources in a way to make the organization much more agile and much more innovative than it otherwise would be. It's not easy. Neither is the information flows. A lot of these people that join the firm say, my gosh, it's costly for me to have to think about who might be able to benefit from this information. But at the end of the day, when that information flows, that's how we bring the whole firm to our clients. That's how it's done. That's how it gets integrated. And then the third point, and this is my last point. A lot of people at the firm will look at it and say, my gosh, you know, I did very, very well at my previous firm and really treated a bit like a star. And there's no star culture here, or less of one, that people aren't separated out and put on a pedestal. Now, of course, that happens Everybody, I'm not saying there's no star quality there, but when people get that feeling, they get a sense of teamwork that goes way beyond the kind of teamwork that you get in really hierarchical organizations. Do people hoard information or do they share it? Does the firm feel hierarchical or does it feel flat? And how do these decisions get made? These are core cultural fundamental elements that create an ecosystem within which innovation occurs. And the kinds of innovations I'm talking about can be something as simple as taking something that we've always done in one division and something we've always done in another, and take one of those groups and bring it over and put it organizationally in this group over here. Create an integrated service that looks and feels different to the clients. People say innovation in financial industry, people will copy it in 3 weeks. No reason to be first. When you can be first, and when there are organizational challenges to your competitors from replicating what you've done, that's when you can harvest a lot from those advantages. So competing on innovation, absolutely central. The organizational culture, central to that. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Franz Cremer.
Chow. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. You might allow me to stay here, at least for the beginning, due to the fact, that I'm not a native speaker. So I came here to Korea with a well-prepared speech for 20 minutes, and everything is written down very nicely. But I've just learned I just get 10 minutes. I'm standing here for manufacturing, and I should probably change what I have prepared. So that is for all the young persons here in the room, a lesson that you should take. Life is always changing. Be adaptable, be agile, and try to be as flexible as possible. Let me start with manufacturing. Sitting there and being now the manufacturing guy is a little bit like old economy. On one side, there is financial services that are all the smart guys. They make the big bucks. There is British Telecom. Telecom stands for Internet. Telecom stands for working wireless around the world. There is an airport. Airport is a fantastic industry, especially that one. They just got the first Airbus A380 in Singapore the other day, a very exciting one. And then comes manufacturing. What is the difference between these elements and manufacturing? There are none, and there are huge differences. Huge differences. We are operating with 106,000 employees worldwide. 106,000 employees worldwide in manufacturing means that you have something like 70,000 to 75,000 people on workshop floor. Not, as Professor Fukuyama said this morning, that these people are untrained like they were probably many years ago with General Motors. Absolutely not. They are highly skilled, they are well trained, they are responsible for the quality they are producing every day and the quality that you are expecting wherever in this world. And we are selling our products in 130 countries. And everybody expects the same quality wherever he drives one of our products, whether it is a BMW, a Mini, or a Rolls-Royce. So bringing that is, we have to find ways to skill our people, to give them a chance to be somewhere between torn in a very concrete process with zero tolerance on one hand, and on the other hand, to have their own responsibility, to have their hand on the cord of the line and that they can't stop it. So they have to learn to be accountable, responsible on one side, and on the other side, individualism in a car plant is limited to very few elements. By knowing that, that is only one part of our country, of our company, sorry. Second part, of course, is we have in more than 30 countries around in the world, we have our sales teams. And yesterday I had the chance to talk to our sales team here in South Korea. Our president, Dr. A.J. Kim, gave me the chance to learn more about what is happening here. and that is completely different. Then we are acting, very briefly, put it in a local environment where we have the group aspects on one side. That is what makes BMW tick. And we have on the other side South Korea, a very clear market with its own values. And we have to bring these two things together. We at BMW, we are very proud of our, let's call them genes. And these genes at BMW, the values, the basic beliefs, you can take whatever is appropriate in your language, they stand for 7 major things. And these 7 major things are, first of all, identification. Whatever we are doing and wherever we are doing it, what we want to have from our associates, what we really like to have is, first of all, identification. Secondly, reliability. Reliability in all its aspects. Reliability, that is what our customers can expect from us, of course. But we want to have reliability from our local offices, wherever they are in the world. We want to have reliability from our associates that are work in our plants, because without the reliability, that system cannot work. As our products, we like performance. We are convinced that a successful company, whatever businesses does, is linked to high performance. If you are not a high performer, you cannot win the game, simply. We are in tough competition. And tough competition means to train every day, as sportsmen did it, and then as soon as the day of the competition is there, you have to bring your performance. Point number 4 is passion. Passion is an ingredient that is absolutely important in a way that if you do a job or whatever you are doing, you can be a pupil, you can be a, I don't know, many other professions. What you need is that will to win, is that will to be the best, is that will to do something more than 100%. I'm convinced, we are convinced in BMW, that a good managed company will achieve 100%. Badly managed, probably 70%. A good managed company with passion, with identification, will achieve 130%. You get that 30% extra by having the right leaders, by having people who can create an atmosphere of passion, who can create an atmosphere of identification. We are a can-do culture. Not standing there and discussing, and probably it can work, it cannot work, just let's try it, let's do it. If we don't do it, you'll never know whether it would have worked or not. And with would have, you cannot win the game. Therefore, the can-do culture. Freedom is very important for us. Freedom, meaning the company's independence on one side, because only independent companies can be a interesting partner for others. If you are not independent enough, so why should others talk to you? They never know, is it you they are talking to, or are they talking to whom? Are they talking to somebody who is influenced by a third party? And only if you are independent, you can make your own decision. With not making your own decisions, you are like a puppet on a string. And nobody within, at least our company, wants to be a puppet on the string. We also see this freedom for every individual. If you want to have a culture of freedom in the company, you cannot force the individual in a role that they do not want. That is what we see on the other side. Point 7, we call it teamwork. What we do mean is the way we work together, and I was really grateful to see the presentation of Professor Fukuyama this morning. Yes, networking, trust, of course. That are all things that we hope to live, that we want to achieve, that are ingredients in our daily work. But as we have heard it this morning, it depends on the situation you are in. If you are always on that path of trust, that may not pay out, because there are situations where you just have to give an order. That might be not very popular to say that here, but that is what we have at the end of the day. You have to make a decision. You cannot wait until the democracy of the company has come up with an opinion. That is not good enough. So you need a trustful environment, of course, otherwise you cannot deal with all these changes, with all these challenges that you have, because then people will leave or are very satisfied or get risk averse. That is what we cannot use. We need innovative people, but being innovative means, on the other hand, to take a risk, and taking a risk means that you have a counterpole, if I can say it that way, and that means trust. On the other hand, that shouldn't end up in social romantic situations. Social romantic situations are not good enough to succeed in that competitive world that we are in. Therefore, let me come to my final point from what makes us tick as we tick. That is point of leadership. I know leadership, probably you can't hear it anymore, but I think it is very important. Leadership distinguished from management. You need to manage your company. That is to administer, to achieve certain targets. This administration can be learned. This administration has a specific toolbox, and that is what we understand with management. That is what you need to a certain aspect in your company, in terms of a certain amount of your managers really have to be managers. And then you need a certain amount of managers who we call leaders. What is the difference? Leaders, from our point of view, they have to invent the future. They have to lead the company to a specific point. They have to be in a situation that they can convince people to do the right thing, to do unknown thing, to follow them in unknown areas, to take a risk. And having that mixture of managers and leaders, having a basis of more than 100,000 people who have the right passion, who have the right values, who have the right identification, and of course are highly qualified. Bringing all these things together, that from my point of view is a good way to succeed in the future. Thank you very much.
Mr. Fong.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. 2 weeks ago, I read an article in the Harvard Business Review, and the thrust of the article concerns corporate leadership. And basically, the thesis of the article, based on the study done by the authors, is this: that they've studied a couple of organizations, and they identified 3 key areas where judgment calls are particularly critical to the development of an organization. They name it, crisis, strategy, and people judgment. I think the most important finding of this study was that a CEO, a senior manager, a company can make mistakes in relation to crisis, in relation to strategy, and they can normally repair them. They can save their careers, they can save their company. But frequently, mistakes relating to people judgment, selecting the right people, putting the right people in the right jobs, these are fatal judgments. That means if they make a mistake in this, very few of the companies literally recover.
And so I think this study, Professor Chow reaffirms, I think, the importance of this discipline, human resources, the importance of understanding people, and I think it attests, to the timeliness of a subject being given such national prominence here in Korea. Now, I represent an industry that is, in many sense, established, and at the same time, because of the dynamics of the new economies, the changing world order, are confronted with many changes on many fronts. And what I thought I'll do is perhaps just to say that just within the space of this morning, I have seen a lot of principles and insights that are being shared. And I'd like to invite you to perhaps consider how we could apply this more effectively in the case of Changi airports. And I know that there are a lot of experts here, there are a lot of people who are running very successful companies and organizations. And so perhaps during the discussion period, we could do that. So let me share firstly the backdrop of the industry. And I think the most important thing to note from this slide is that there are changing, the industry has to confront a lot of changes on the technological front. New aircraft like the Boeing Dreamliner, the A380, which we just received in Changi and which is going to operate tomorrow. Now this changes the complexion of air travel. But I think the most important issue from this slide is the rise of Asia in the context of the aviation industry. When I first started working 30 years ago, the idea of mega airports reside mainly in Europe and in America. But based on the projections from IATA, from ICAO, that's the International Civil Aviation Organization, the consensus today is that the mega airports in 20 years' time will be found in Asia. The aggregation of connectivity of people, of business in Shanghai, in Beijing, in Mumbai, in Delhi is going to see a demand for the transformation of air travel in this parts like we've never seen before. So when I think about human resources, we have to grapple with the demands placed on our human resources capacity in the light of these changes. And this permeates throughout the whole human resources development process in our organization. We have, on the one hand, we are very, very conscious about the need to preserve and to develop on what we have on the lessons that we have learned in developing Changi, on what we call domain expertise, the specific unique advantages and differentiation we bring to the processes in Changi. But at the same time, we understand that these new forces which I've just described is going to change air travel, and we somehow have to factor this into the way we develop our people. And then, of course, like any human resource development program, you have to match people to jobs. That, again, is going to change because of the new kind of people that we necessarily have to bring into the organization because of the changes in the rules of the game. And then finally, we have talked about leadership. Again, it is a very prevalent issue in Singapore and specifically in my industry. The other speakers have touched on them. And what I might do later on is just to perhaps cite one or two examples of how some of these preparations have been made and some of these changes have been made. I think the first of the issues which I have raised concerns the development, the building on what we have learned, rather than throw everything out and reinventing everything. And that is what we call, building up our store of domain knowledge. We take this very seriously because a lot of the processes in the industry, a lot of the understanding of the industry, how connectivity generates activities in the airport, as well as around the airport, are not as well documented as in other fields. Indeed, one of the difficulties that I think the industry faces is that there is a surfeit of education and training support from colleges and universities in fields like airport management, airport planning, and disciplines like that. There are many reasons to go into, but what might be said shortly is that there's a kind of a vicious cycle, because the less the importance of these disciplines are articulated, the less the providers rise to offer facilities and support for the training of these people, and in turn, the less well-known the careers within these disciplines are to the general public and to school leavers in particular. So in Singapore, what we have to do is we have to invest in this education and training. We set up what's called a Singapore Aviation Academy as part and parcel of our development programs in Changi. It's a very heavy investment because we have to simulate through computers every kind of possible management situation that we encounter in an airport. And that's the way we train people to understand, to get used to the skills. But that's just one part of the training, because that's the part of training that relates to specific skill sets. The other part of the training that has to deal with understanding how innovations come about, how do we seize on important issues and anticipate them and prepare before these issues confront us in reality. So that is the very much part and parcel of the next item of the next issue that I raised, and that concerns matching the talent, matching the people, the skills, the talent with the right jobs. We have, today available various forms of deliveries of training and experience sharing. But we feel that one of the components that still cannot be replaced completely is that of mentoring. Someone who's more experienced mentoring, developing a younger colleague, whether it relates to engineering, whether it relates to the management processes in the airport, whether it relates to making an investment call on an airport they want to invest in a foreign country. And so we have in place in Changi a very concerted effort to try to ensure that we have a team of mentors, and the team of mentors execute a mentoring plan with their specific charges. We can't see any way of replacing this completely, even though this is extremely time consuming and it takes a lot of effort and resources. And then finally, the development of leaders. I think this becomes very, very, the importance of this becomes very clear if we look at what happened to the aviation industry over the last 10 years. And I think it didn't really affect the aviation industry, it affects every facet of the economy in this part of the world. I think first of all, we had the Asian financial crisis, where we see passenger growth and cargo growth jolted in the late 90s. And then there was a flu, the Asian flu. And then finally, the 9/11, which changed the processes basically in the airport completely overnight. Now, in each of these cases, the industry as a whole was badly affected. Assumptions were made wrong. Orders for planes, for example, were held up because one has to deal with the prospects that some of these changes might considerably be structural. So there was this tumult of uncertainty over the last 10 years. But here's where leadership comes in. Leadership recognizes that some of these events presents opportunities. I think I just had a breakfast meeting, I think, with my colleague, your colleague from Dubai. I think, for example, in Dubai sees, I think, a lot of these opportunities developing from an airstrip to a very major air hub over the last 10 to 15 years, right? And in Singapore, one of the incidents that might relate in connection with the Asian flu crisis was the amount of the difficulty we had to contend with in controlling health security, health inspections, in conducting health inspections of passengers arriving from the airport. And it used to be that we had to take temperatures using ear thermometers, and that took too long. And so somebody on the ground, in fact a very young manager, decided that he would try something else. And because we were allowed to sort of delegate quite a bit of authority to him, he seized upon this idea of using a scan that was developed for military purpose for scanning temperatures by just arranging for passengers to walk through a kind of a portal. And you see that being implemented in Changi as well as in many, many other airports. And that's, I think, is an example of how something like that could change the processing profile of an airport and its production capacity quite considerably. Now, moving ahead, some of the other issues that we have to contend with concerns the kind of Confucian values in which Singapore is basically set. Now, we are basically a society that's still very traditional, where there's this perceived sense that there is a hierarchy, not just in terms of organizations, but in the way life is structured. And I think the way the new forces, the new drivers, economic drivers have actually sort of impacted us is to suggest to many of us that perhaps it's time that we loosened the binds to the kind of traditional structure and sense of order that we treasure so much in Asian society. So, to take an instance, in the past, leadership associations is associated mainly with the better school, right? You have to go to the right school, the right connections, and so on. Now, this is giving way very quickly to one where the driving what they call denominator is really whether these persons can formulate the right solutions for the kind of management situations that we are confronted with, the creativity type, the types that can bring entrepreneurship to a different level. And so our society is changing, but perhaps we do not as yet have as much flexibility in terms, because of these societal perceptions, as someone in the West. But I think, like any Asian society, we recognize that we do need to change. And the process has started. And we are, I guess, the verdict now is that the jury is still out. And it is an idea, it's an area that I think I'll be hoping to receive some exchanges and understanding from our discussions with the participants gathered here. Thank you very much.
Well, we have originally 1 hour and a half, and now we have already 50 minutes passed. So still we have 40 more minutes. And let us use these 40 minutes in a very productive and effective way. First, let me summarize the presentations of these 4 panel members. Indeed, among their presentations, I found some differences and some commonalities, differences, commonalities. Well, as I said, all of these 4 presenters came from 4 different industries: finance, telecommunications, manufacturing, and infrastructure and service. Yet they have the same characteristic. That is, each of them is the leader in her own field. Well, Goldman Sachs is the leader, BMW is the leader, Changi Airport, I believe, is the leader. Although Incheon Airport, people may think differently, but then British Telecom is again the leader. So we indeed witness the four leaders of their four presenters in four leading sectors, four leading companies. And then each presenter made key words which seem to be somewhat different. For example, Mr. Verwaayen emphasized the importance of globalization, yet he said that his service, the nature of the service is very local. So how to globalize the traditional local business. That seems to be the keyword for him. And then Mr. Richard Lyons, former professor, made a very colorful presentation, yet his emphasis was on innovation, creating value, which I believe everyone feels its importance in the same way. And then Mr. Franz Cremer emphasized 7 major aspects, or 7 genes, as key components of his management. And then Mr. Fong emphasized the importance of talents, leaders, through training and education. Yet, again, there seem to be some commonalities, which I'd like to make in this way. That is, in the past, in the field of business administration, there are different fields, such as human resources management and strategy. Well, in the human resources management, in a traditional way, the scholars emphasize the importance of training and educating workers and managers. Then, in the field of strategy, they emphasize the importance of the leadership and necessary attributes that leaders should possess in their respective organizations. But nobody really talked about how to cultivate, how to groom, how to develop leaders in either disciplines. Now, all of you are emphasizing the importance of developing leaders, how to create, how to make leaders out of ordinary people. And so perhaps in this regard, I'd like to ask some more specific questions, how in each of your organizations you develop the leaders, not the workers and managers, but the leaders. Are the leaders coming from the heaven, or are you grooming them from within the organizations? Ben?
Well, leadership is 2 things. First of all, it's in the eye of the beholder. Because leadership is not to be judged by the leader, her or himself. Leadership is what other people contribute to a person. The willingness to follow, the willingness to challenge, the willingness to create together is what the leader makes the leader. Follow, challenge, and create. Now, I think we have trained people to be leaders by power and by hiring. I don't think we have trained people to create and challenge. But in a world where speed is going up and culture and innovation and culture awareness and innovation, creativity is becoming key for success.
Do you have a specific internal system to groom, develop the leaders that have challenge and creativity?
Well, the word system
Yes.
applies directly to what I just said. So we don't have a system in the classical way. You have companies that have a system that says, if you go to this job, then naturally you go to that job, there you go to that job, and you can already see in company 34 that are you in that position there, so you will end up being the vice chairman 25 years from now. I don't believe in that system.
Of course.
If the system is taking talented individual, giving them a kick upstairs, that's what we do. Our director of strategy, she is 32 years old, and she came from a totally different industry. And at 32, running an organization that has to create a new strategy for 160,000 people around the world is pretty challenging if you're 32.
Sure.
But I believe that a kick upstairs is the best system that there is.
The management itself. Yes. Franz? Richard? Yes.
I'll agree with Ben here. At Goldman Sachs, leadership development is very action-based. We use that term, I'm sure most of you do as well. We have a few high-potential leadership acceleration programs. These are 6-month programs where people are not taken offline, but are mixed with people from other divisions. They shadow the senior-most leaders to get to really see the look and feel of enterprise-wide issues. They work across teams, again, across divisions on issues that are of enterprise-wide significance. For example, if there's a new business opportunity in a particular region or a big issue that the executive office is concerned with and wants 6 or 7 managing directors from different divisions to sit down and think about that. That's the kind of experience or action-based learning that we do a lot of. So I think it focuses on some of the elements that have come up already. Leadership is fundamentally about setting a direction, right? It's not planning and budgeting. It's one of the associated management. It is setting a direction or a vision. It is aligning people around that vision and the articulation of the future. Alignment is very different from staffing and organizing. And it is about motivating people and inspiring them. And that's very different from managerial control and problem solving. So we try to keep the focus on those 3 categories.
Yes. Friends? That's right. Yeah.
But in general, you are seen as leaders or your peers or your bosses and from your associates. If they start to follow you, if your peers recognize that you have the better ideas, that you are trustworthy, etc., then you are growing as a leader in such an organization. And that then ends up that you get other jobs, that you get jobs where you need more leadership. And you are not given a job that is more a managerial job. So that is a question of development. I wouldn't take the word evolution, but it's really a development of a personality, and that is what can happen. But and there is one but, when you have a look at history, a lot of great leaders didn't good for the people who followed them. So at the company, we have to be very careful and have to have a control or a look at these things. That is one job of HR, to make sure that the leaders never forget what they are leading for.
Great. Yes. Mr. Fong, how do you groom leaders in your organization?
I agree with what has been said so far, that to the extent that an organization cannot predict who will emerge as leaders, and to that extent that you cannot predict who are likely to emerge as leaders, you can't, in a sense, expect any grooming system or any system of training to be spot on I think what a good training system or good system of at least preparing people for leadership positions can do is to provide some basic skills, basic opportunities for them to interact. For example, one can arrange deliberately for a certain amount of functional rotation, a certain amount of exposure to work in a different kind of cultural environment. I mean, that can be deliberately planned. But whether a particular person takes advantage of that, that's probably beyond the mandate that should be assigned to the setting up of the system. I think leaders emerge in management situations, in crisis, in situations where organizations has come to and where they need, they are faced with a different problem, a different challenge. And to the extent that the environment encourages these people to rise up, to take the challenge, to offer a solution, to offer a proposal, to offer something that may not have been precedented in any way within the context of the organization. I think that's as much an organization can do. And beyond that, I think it really depends a lot on the luck of the organization, whether you recruited the right people in the first place.
Yes. It seems in principle you all share the same way, but specifically each of you have a very different, I would say, symbiotic type of mechanisms. And let me ask one sort of relevant question, that is, well, each one of you are from different parts of the world. Ben is originally from Netherlands, but now in Great Britain. You are from the United States, and then Franz, you are from Germany, which is totally different from Great Britain. I guess in the way German soccer is different from British soccer. And then you're from Singapore. And how in each of the countries they provide the materials for leadership talents in the Great Britain? Well,
before that I worked in the US for 7 years. And one of the things that I've noticed, and this is a good example, the panel, is that although we talk about globalization, the DNA of organizations is such that there is still a very natural tendency to have nationals in the top of the organization, which flies directly into the face of truly everything we talked so far. As does the glass ceiling for women, which is around the globe a huge problem, because we have a war for talent and we have 50% of the top talent in the world that has less of a chance than other talents. And we have the cultural differences of a cozy top that preaches to the rest of the organization, please be multicultural. Now, my top in our organization has 17 different passports in the top 200. And whether that has anything to do with the fact that I came as a foreigner into the organization, I leave that to the audience. But the fact of the matter is, if you want to truly become a global organization, you have to put the money where your mouth is. As a leader, you can only do 3 things. You can set the tone, you can set the agenda, and you can choose the people. That's it. All the rest is for everybody else. Now, we talk a lot about globalization and diversity and culture, but if I'm honest, most of the organizations that I know in the world have a national flag in their head when it comes to the top tier of the organization. And I think that is unsustainable. And we have to go through the pain to just not allow, country managers to be locals. And yes, we are very much for that. But if you look to the boards and you look to the management layer, number one, you'll find a national flag in the majority of situations, the dominant culture. And I think that is unsustainable.
And British Telecom is not, so it's sustainable.
Yeah, but we had a crisis, and a crisis is a great thing to have because, you go to strange places to find a solution, and all of a sudden, next phase, you're in a different phase. So I don't want to use us as a kind of an example, that would be wrong. But the fact of the matter is that you have that tendency everywhere. It's not exclusive in one country or the other country. It's a problem, I think, everywhere.
Richard?
It's a very important question. So Goldman Sachs, just to give the flavor, this is the first year, this fiscal year, that Goldman Sachs will earn more outside of the U.S. than inside the U.S. Many of these other firms went through that transition some time ago. But it really wasn't long ago that about a third of income came from outside the U.S., and it probably won't be long until 2/3 does. So we're right in the middle of that. When you go from 1/3 to 2/3, that's a transformational interval. And a lot of those changes are happening right now at Goldman Sachs. Korea is a wonderful example. This is a place that we are, this is probably our fastest growing office. It's a very clear for us, a long-term commitment, long-term partnership with lots of clients here. And as we think about growing the region, for example, I mentioned those leadership acceleration programs earlier. We now are bringing in a lot more of the people working in those regional offices, international people, into those leadership acceleration programs, because we have to develop that particular slice of our leadership capability. The one thing, though, that I would mention is that the organizational culture is very strong at Goldman Sachs, and I think it is very well aligned, I'd like to think it is, with the business model. And that actually requires that you use the three, as a human capital management group, to use the three levers available to you when making sure that that culture sustains itself. The whole process of recruitment and selection has a lot of culture in it at Goldman Sachs. The whole process of training and socialization has a lot of culture embedded in it. And then the third level, the whole process of rewards and recognition has a lot of culture embedded in it. Last comment, and I'll stop. My first interview for my job with Goldman Sachs, a very senior person, I won't mention her name, looked at me and said, "Do you understand how important culture transmission is to this job?" I hadn't thought very much about that. I've thought a lot more about it since I first heard it.
What was your answer to that question?
I told her I was ready to embrace that concept, but I needed to. My very last interview was with a senior person who said, "Do you really get this culture? Because it won't do you a favor or us if you come, and it doesn't quite feel right."
Friends, I understand that Mr. Kim Hyo-jun, who is CEO of Korean operation of BMW, is one of the corporate executives. Is it an indicative of your globality, or?
Yes and no.
Yes and no.
Of course, we can use Dr. Kim as a perfect example to integrate somebody from a different country, from a different culture in the group culture. But on the other hand, there are many other people working for BMW in different countries, and then I'm with Ben. They are not all local. Some of them are local, and some of them they are sent from Germany to get international experience. That is the first contradiction. We want to have international experience in the headquarters, so we send people outside, but not in the same extent we get people to come to Germany. There are three reasons for that. One might be that the organization, that the headquarters is a little bit reluctant to take people. Second is that, unfortunately, we are in Germany and only 110 to 120 million people around the world speak German. If you are a UK or US or South Africa or wherever based company, you have a huge advantage that people can take their native language. And I can understand that people around in the world learn English, learn Spanish, learn Chinese, but not German. So that is a point that we have to learn to deal with, because we need to be more international as we are today. The top 360 have 11 passports within BMW. So, but that is not enough. Third point, what we have achieved, and that has to do with the company and the brand. The brand and the company, you cannot divide it. Even if we have three brands now, but this BMW. And that BMW culture and that being proud of BMW, that is what you find here in South Korea, that is what you find in South America or in South Africa or in Sweden. It doesn't matter. So there is a common ground. That common ground is described by the 7 genes that I said. We are right now creating, creating the fourth set of a cultural description of BMW in terms of basic beliefs. All that helps to have that international understanding. Last point, we had that discussion, how international should BMW be? Because our service is to give cars to people, and they want to have that specific car that comes from Germany. Even if we have achieved now that we can produce it around the world and it is recognized as made by BMW and not made in Germany. But that made by BMW is still engineered in Germany. So we decided to say, yes, we are a German or probably a Bavarian-based company, but we want to be internationally successful. The other way around could be, yes, we are an international company, but that would be artificial. It would simply not be true, and today we could not live up to that. So we said, let's be, in a way, what we can deliver.
So differentiation is the name of the game. So, well, Mr. Fong, no question that Singapore is the most global part of Asia, and how do you preserve that globality in Singapore and in your company?
I think one of the features of Singapore that might appear odd, perhaps to some of your participants here, is that we have a population of 4 million people, basically, of which 1.2, 1.3 million people are what we call our guest workers. They are expatriates. They come from many, many different nationalities. So over the last 2 decades or so, this is a reality that we have to live with. That if we are going to exceed the kind of GDP growth that that we will otherwise be stuck with, we need the productivity that comes in with by blending our workforce in the country with foreigners who can help us really, who can embellish that, who can complement our job skill sets in Singapore. So we have all along have a very attractive program for attracting foreigners to our shores. For example, in my company, when we recruit entrants at for our training programs, for management programs, perhaps it may not be something new to someone like Richard, but for an Asian company, we would recruit around the world. So we have, say, in our ranks, Australians, Russians, Thais, Malaysians, Chinese nationals, Indian nationals. So we have some. I mean, for our setup, we have probably about 12 nationalities. So I think that is useful for us because it forces us, even if we are just doing work in Singapore, to be able to relate to each other's cultural sensitivities and so on and so forth. So we have a slightly easier time when we sort of assign people abroad, because of this this rich mix of people in the country itself and within the organization. And for airport like Changi, we at a very basic level, we do need to anticipate some of the issues that will automatically be thrown up because of the airlines that we serve from different parts of the world.
Great, thank you. Well, we have about 10 more minutes, and I guess it's time that we open the discussion to the floor. If you have questions, comments, or suggestions to these 4 gentlemen, please raise hands and get the chance. Anybody? Yes, please. Please make your comments short. And would you please start with identifying yourself?
Yeah, my name is Dr. from Morocco.
Just have the microphone, please.
Sorry. My name is Dr. El-Kesimi from the Arab delegation here. I'd like to know how do you develop your leaders in the company? You talked about training specialists and developing leaders. how do you develop those leaders? Thank you.
Well, basically what we do is we have, I think, a program like most companies. We provide programs of training for job entrance, and we hope that in our recruitment we are able to identify sufficient number of people with potential leadership qualities. And then it's really through a series of job assignments, functional rotations, postings abroad, where we hope to identify the surfacing of leadership qualities, and then the potentials are then mentored, as I said. Someone will track them, and I think this is very much part and parcel of leadership development that I think most companies can afford to do, and in fact are doing it.
Right. Thank you. Any other questions? Please. Just wait a second. Oops. Wait on, please. Yes.
그 인재 양성에 대해서 지금 말씀하신 거 잘 들었습니다. 가장 중요하다고 저는 요새 와서 생각하는 것이 영적인 각성 쪽에 상당히 그 리더십 인재 양성에 중요하다고 생각이 되는데 아무도 그 측면에서는 강조를 안 하셨는데 그런 측면에서 좀 멘트를 해주시기 바랍니다.
어느 면에서 영적?
Spiritual upgrade, 영적인 걸 뭐 영어로 뭐라고 말씀을 드려야 될지 모르겠지만, spiritual 측면에서요.
Yeah. Well, this gentleman is asking the importance of the grooming spiritual leadership rather than physical or mental. Because nowadays the spiritual seems to be a key word. Annie, would you please? Yes.
Well, it's a wonderful question. When we think about leadership, we try to cast it in as broad a basis as we can. Let me just give you one example. We just finished one of those leadership acceleration programs, and one of the Goldman Sachs board members spoke at that. And she spent most of her time talking about the importance of philanthropic leadership. This is a set of managing directors that hadn't quite reached the partner level. And she was basically saying that the expectations in that space have been raised. I realize that's just one little part of what you're describing there. But that was an element of the kind of messaging that I think goes through a lot of these leadership programs to get people to understand the wider context within which they operate, particularly in terms of the meaning making that is so essential for attracting the top young talent in the marketplace.
Well, indeed, I also heard when I was in China that the Chinese Communist Party has started to move Chinese economy toward the soul-based economy. I guess that rhymes with what you said. Well, shall we have just one more question, please?
Thank you. It's a question for Mr. Cremer. If I understand correctly, the BMW company is a family-owned company, so by the family Quant. So I would like to know if you think that you have a long-term perspective, a long-term planning, longer than companies that are not family-owned.
Human resources management, when the company turns sort of more public, I guess.
That's a question I'm afraid I cannot answer. We are very satisfied with the situation that we do have. That situation has risen the company now from 59 to nearly 50 years in a beautiful company. I have to say it in that way. And as long as we are, as a management team, plus 106,000 people worldwide, good enough and have good revenues and have a good ROE, why should they change it?
So management or governance is only the means rather than the objective in itself. Great. Well, I think that time is up, and I'd like to spend the last few minutes to make a summary of what these four remarkable presenters made. And you might remember at the very beginning that I mentioned the two models, oscillation model and convergence model. And indeed, these gentlemen, at least to my mind, have provided me with the right answers to the questions that I had in my mind. Well, using the oscillation model, well, I believe that there are two possibilities. One is to keep or continue the present more or less egalitarian-based policy in education. And the other model is back to the previous hierarchically oriented model in sort of education in Korea. But perhaps the choice between the two is not the right answer anymore. Perhaps this convergence model can be a better suited for us to think of the future model of our education policy. Well, so far we have been using this human resources management model and human capital management model, which seems to be a little bit more advanced. But indeed, in the future, all of the presenters seem to come to an agreement that the leadership is important and talents are the key to this human resources management. So perhaps from now on, you should be thinking of this talent strategy as a key word in education policy. What the talent is letting talent lead the way in our society to create value. And indeed, we are now in the 21st century, and unlike in the 20th century, where when the heroes were dead, now heroes have become alive, and we have to find heroes in our society, in each organization, and in ourselves. So I believe that the future education policy should be in finding and grooming and nurturing these talents in our human resources and making each one of us heroes in ourselves. So I thank you all for having participated in this panel, and would you please give big hands to our four heroes. This concludes the session B, and thank you very much.
Well, let's see. I hope this will begin. There we go. It's not a good idea standing behind a room full of hungry people and lunch. So I'll try to make this brief, as long as we can get the slides up. While they're doing that, I want you to understand a couple of points to begin with. One is that futurists do not know the future. We may take bets, we may make lucky guesses, we may be right, but you could have a flying saucer come from an extraterrestrial place, land on this hotel, and everything would change immediately. But what we are good at is talking about a lot of possibilities. We study those possibilities, what's likely to happen, what's possible to happen, but we don't claim to know the truth of the future. Now, I would like you to remember and appreciate the amount of change that has happened in the world, not only in Korea, but in the world in the last 25 years. The next 25 years should make the previous 25 years look slow. The future is going to be more than most people think because the things that make the change are accelerating. And therefore, what we think is possible should also change. Ubiquitous computing, nanotechnology, biotechnology, information technology, and cognitive science themselves are changing more rapidly right now than they were just a few years ago. And there's no reason to believe that their speed is going to slow down. And the price is falling, and the globalization is expanding at the same time. So this accelerates the acceleration. 25 years ago, there was no internet, World Wide Web, PCs, mobile phones. NATO was certainly not in Afghanistan. If I had told you that Euros were going to be a major force in the world, they'd say the Europeans will never get it together, but they did. There was no talk of globalization really 25 years ago. Futurists did, yes, but the average person was not dealing with globalization. There was no talk of genetically modified food, no AIDS pandemic knocking out the management class of an entire continent 25 years ago. And the idea of asymmetrical warfare, a small group of people holding a major superpower at bay, would have been considered absolutely silly. And 25 years ago, if I talked to audiences like this, and if I asked you how many of you think we're going to have World War III and blow up, the majority of the hands 25 years ago would go up. Which means that the unconscious mind 25 years ago thought that long-range stuff was irrelevant because we won't be alive in 25 years. That was the majority view 25 years ago. So, 25 years ago, who would have believed in Korea that business in Korea would be out-competing the United States in transportation, not only cars, but shipbuilding, communications, Samsung, of course, information systems, making chips. Who would have believed these things just 25 years ago? So if those previous 25 years will be slow compared to the next 25 years, then we really have to change what we think is possible. And this is important, because if you don't think something is possible, you won't try to make it happen. In human resources, who would have believed to have put into play the idea of personal computers? Who would have believed that teachers 25 years ago would have had classrooms 25 years later with computers? Who would have believed that millions of people would search millions of computer accesses in less than a second and then do it again at no extra cost? Economists would say, I'm sorry, young man, you're very nice, but you don't understand how the world works. Well, one of the primary drivers, as we all know, is the speed of computers. If we take a look at this little chart here, which you can get in Wikipedia, anybody can find this, you maybe have already seen it, but today we are somewhere around the ability of an insect or a mouse's brain. By 2025, we expect that to be, or less, we expect it to be the equivalent of a human brain. And in 25 years from that, of all human brains. So imagine having the computational capability of all the brains in this room at your fingertips, but imagine it being billions of people, not just the people in this room. And that every person will have that capability too. What becomes possible is way beyond our imaginations. When we talk about human resources development, we're talking about human development for the future. What kind of future? What kind of capabilities are we going to have? Well, a couple of thoughts is that falling birth rates will mean that the workforce will have a lot of older people. Now, the breakthroughs in longevity research really haven't come to fore yet. When people say that people are living longer, what they're really looking at is the babies are not dying as often, and standard of living has made things better. All right? So we've gotten that extension, but we have the threshold of many breakthroughs in biology that's going to change the nature of DNA and how it survives and how we go into the future. It is impossible for me to believe that in the next 10 to 25 years we will not have significant breakthroughs. There's many researches in many different areas going on right now. Some of those should come through. And like with computers, the longevity research will be expensive to begin with, but the price will come down. So older age people may not look like older age people today. We're in the process now of writing genetic code. In the past, we used to read genetic code, understand genetic code. As you know, there's going to be an announcement very soon, I think is coming around soon, that out of straight chemistry, in a laboratory, Craig Venter will be making a DNA. I'm not talking about genetic engineering, where you take a part of one gene and put it to another in gene splicing. I'm talking about making it from scratch. We will be able to write computer code like we write software code. Think of how many software codes, software programs exist in the world. Now think of that as being so many different life forms. That's a much different world for people in the future. Eugenics is a new one, controversial. We'll see how it pans out, but this is the business. Before we talked about just DNA, but there's molecules that go around the DNA that can constrict or open up the capabilities of DNA, and those things can be changed within one lifetime, not just the genetic changes through lifetimes, which means that the human may also evolve a little faster than we thought. More than half the world spends more than half its time in cyberspace. When I say cyberspace, I'm not simply just talking about looking at a computer screen. I'm talking about having multi-levels of virtual reality that is keeping your attention more than this world here. Because we'll have voxels. Voxel is the smallest amount of visual information that's three-dimension. Pixel is the smallest two-dimension. Voxel, you'll be able to just rotate and change the color, rotate in a different direction and change the reflectivity, rotate in a different direction and change it from light to dark. So the ability to make visual information so exciting is around the corner. Voxels have been around for 20 years, by the way. They're just very expensive, but the price will eventually come down. So the virtual reality that we will be living in will be more exciting to us than this kind of reality. And what does the brain do? It goes to what's more exciting. So we'll be living in a multi-cyberspace world. Life extension begins to look more realistic options, as I was mentioning. 3D printing, you know, actually there was material that was printed a couple of years ago on a screen that I watched that actually was from heart to tissue. And it layered upon layered upon layered, and all of a sudden the tissue started beating. I see some heads nodding, you've seen this. The idea of 3D printing of life, let alone 3D prototyping of a building, life. So if we are able to do that, we might be able to do 3D printing at a distance, and why would you have ships going across the Atlantic or the Pacific in international trade? That's a big impact, international trade. We may eventually someday in the future be shipping software back and forth, but maybe not as much physical products if you can make them locally, a thing to consider. Conscious technology becomes a human resources focus. Conscious technology is the idea of the integration of human mind and technology, becoming a continuous flow. We all know that we are using technology to augment our minds. As I put my glasses on my head, I'm augmenting my mind a little bit. We're going to be micro-miniaturizing capabilities, putting it in our bodies, on our bodies. We're going to be having nanotechnology in things that we manufacture that will synthesize voice and recognize voice, so that you'll be talking to your environment will be talking to you as if you're alive. And all of that can interconnect too. So we have a global system of interconnectivity. So what will the human be thinking about in 25 years? And will this be a human or will this be a machine? When I talk to you on a telephone, am I talking to a machine or you? We say, well, I'm talking to you, not a machine. Well, we may be so interconnected with our technology that it's not quite clear that that's a machine or a human. 25 years from now, that may not be such a far-out thought. So we've got the convergence of a couple of trends. One, humans are becoming cyborgs. A cyborg is a human dependent upon technology. Right? Increasingly, that's a phenomenon. That's an increasing trend. You can measure this very easily through patents that are registered. The same thing as our physical environment becomes more intelligent, or it seems to be alive sort of a thing. These two trends will eventually emerge at some point, and it brings in the conscious technology age. Now, futurists like to divide up the past and the future into all kinds of categories. You can have your own, this is my own. But part of the idea of doing this is to give a framework for the mind to think. How do all these specific inventions and new capabilities for the human being, what do they fit? How do they fit all together? When we went from the agricultural age to the industrial age, we weren't quite sure what we were doing. Right? We didn't have global communication systems to learn and have feedback systems, but today we can actually have a community around the world discussing future capabilities. Most governments in the world are beginning to do futures research, strategic planning units. And I've been in a conversation last month with the President of the General Assembly of the United Nations about hooking these things together with UN agencies so we might actually be able to create a collective intelligence to make world policy work better. A fantastic far-out idea just a few years ago. Future Learning and Education, the Millennium project that I direct, is a global think tank, and we were asked to poll our people around the world and come up with what we thought was possible by the year 2030. And what we did is, because we were hoping that Korea might be the first country to do some major moves in human resources and in education, we organized the information. This is all available, by the way, I'll mention it later on, in a way that policymakers can look at it. For example, on each possibility we ask, what might make this possibility a reality? What might make the possibility a good thing? What might prevent this possibility? And what could make it turn out bad? So any decision maker has to consider these kinds of questions in putting together a strategy to make things happen. So for each of these 19 possibilities, there's tons of material on this, and it's available in our State of the Future. Every year we come out with a State of the Future report. Now, virtual reality continues to grow, as I mentioned, but it's not just simply what we have today with Second Life and the cyber towns and the idea of a single place that you go to and you have an avatar and you talk to other avatars. There's going to be interconnecting. I had a meeting just a couple of days ago with one of your Korea's leading companies in games. And I said, well, can you go from one game to another? And he said, no. Well, I said, that's an interesting thing to do, isn't it? Why don't you start to interconnect all the various games around the world? That's a whole new feature. And you can see the royalties and how they can make some more money with that. But what happens, so that imagine you could be in many different virtual realities, in many different personalities, and at the same time. We think of various kinds of virtual realities, like the projection screens, our heads up with our glasses and so forth. But I could live in different kinds of virtual realities, just like we live in different institutional categories. There's business categories, and there's government categories, and there's NGO categories. But there's going to be different kinds of virtual realities, and they will be interconnected, and we'll move back and forth among these. So where are you in such a world? Place is a phenomenon that changes. Where do I end up and where do you begin in such an interactive world? It's a different sort of mobility. Now, I can't read all of these 19 because I know we all want to go to lunch, so I'll make this brief. This is supposed to have been available, but I guess I didn't get it to the conference in time. This PowerPoint presentation, I notice, is not in the book, but I'm sure the conference will make the PowerPoint available to anybody that wants it. But a couple of the items that I thought was extremely interesting for Korea was the first couple there, the National Program for Improving Collective and Individual Intelligence and Just-in-Time Knowledge and Learning. There'll be some panels on this tomorrow. Many of these are very projectable kinds of things. The one on the bottom was the one that was rated the least likely, but that's the one I liked the most. This is the idea where you create an artificial microbe. Remember, you're going to write you write genetic code like you write computer code. So if we can do that, why can't we write a life form that eats the junk in our brain that builds up? You know, when people get old and feeble and so forth, what is that? Well, part of it is this junk that builds up, the sugar or whatever the material is, junk that builds up in our brain. We don't have an easy way to clean that up. Well, why don't we stick something in there to eat it up, clean it up? Well, people consider that too far out. However, I'm going to vote for that one, but I was a minority on this one. Now, let's take a look at how we create collective intelligence. First of all, collective intelligence is a combination of people, software, hardware, information systems that learns through time. That learns, it's not static. It's changing the information and changing the people and the relationships of the software and the hardware all the time. But it's also, in a sense, you have to almost know it. You have to be self-conscious of it. You know, in learning, sometimes there's a difference between saying I learned something and I know I learned it, and I learned it but I didn't know I learned it. There's a difference in the mind. Well, the same thing with collective intelligence. We have to know it's a collective intelligence. Imagine a company creating its own collective intelligence. To some degree, companies have it, but they're not always self-conscious of it. Can't always identify what it is. I'm hoping that Korea might consider making collective intelligence a national goal. What would it mean to take the brains of the country and the software of the country and the materials of the country and the visual information and put it into some sort of interconnected whole so that Korea as a whole can progress mentally through time? Two examples I'll give you that we've helped develop. One is Future's intelligence scanning system. We did this for the Kuwait Oil Company. And then another one is a just-in-time collective intelligence system we're doing now, developing the concepts for a global energy system. Now, in a system like this sort of a collective intelligence, you have a variety. Imagine that the things on the top, press releases, newspapers, journals, monitoring websites, keyword searching, conferences, seminars, key person tracking. This is what your mind is going out to collect. Then you analyze it in some way within an intranet within your corporation. You can judge the information going back and forth. What's the significance to the strategy of the organization? What's important? So you don't just take the information in. That's just a library function. But you're bringing it in and analyzing it. And you have it in such a way that other players can access it. So it's a weblog database. So the units can change. So it's not a static piece of information. It can change with feedback. So that you want to have information that's actually useful. And then people can have feedback requirements. I interviewed a person who studied biological increased intelligence at the National Institute of Health in the United States and said, what's the key thing I should know? And it's responding to feedback was one of the key things. So if you just keep track of a whole bunch of stuff for your organization and pull all the information in and analyze it, and you don't change what you're looking at, then I guarantee you, you will have information overload. And that's not a good idea. So you want to be deselecting and changing what you're looking at all the time. So this is a dynamic model of how you can have a collective intelligence so that every person of the organization, and maybe in the example of Korea, every citizen of Korea, could have a way to input their learning. Like right now, there's a whole room full of brains. You know, I know you have kneecaps and elbows and hips, but I'm just talking to your brains right now, so just the rest of you can relax. So we've got a whole room full of brains. There's no way right now for us to access all the knowledge of all these brains. It's a hard management problem. Might be a nice one to try to figure out, but in collective intelligence, that's what you do. How do you create a system so that the learning of the whole system can be available to everybody else, with some classification systems and some priority systems and so forth? But how do you create a system like this? This is a whole new idea. We never had the dream 25 years ago of making all the knowledge of an organization available to anyone in a way that they can handle it. You know, it was an impossible dream. Now there's MIT even has a center for collective intelligence. So your homework for tonight, ladies and gentlemen, is I would like you to do a Google search on collective intelligence and see what comes up. There's a lot of research going on in this beginning. It's called under different names, but it's going to be a buzzword. It's going to be more popular. As we talked about, globalization is a new buzzword. Collective intelligence will be a buzzword. And we'll see if Korea is the first country to decide to do this. Another model we're working on, another collective intelligence model, it's a little different. The little balls in the bottom there are human beings. So imagine that you have, we're going to look in this case, energy. Imagine that you were going to have a political hearing. And in my country, a lot of times political hearings don't always ask the right questions. And it's very frustrating. And so laws are passed that don't take into account the state-of-the-art of knowledge, the state-of-the-art of engineering, or state-of-the-art. We end up with some stupid decisions, right? So how can you support a collective intelligence within the political system, on this case, energy? So you could say, okay, coming up is a hearing. It's going to be about energy. So who are the top experts around the world on these issues? Would they be available online? Even if they happen to be a conference in Seoul, Korea, could they be online? So that you have a reservoir of people who are experts. That's part of the puzzle. Another part of the puzzle is that you have various knowledge database systems. And there's a term called mashup. Some of you, I'm sure, probably know this. It's where you have frameworks over different databases so that they can actually put things together. So it doesn't matter if there's different kinds of databases around the world. So it's a way to put together the knowledge of the world very quickly. And then other kinds of sources. So these things can be available to a staff person supporting the congressman, distilling it very quickly, and then having instant messaging going back and forth between the staff person and the politician. So in real time, in a hearing, just like I'm looking down at these screens in front of me, in real time I could be getting little dashboards or little portholes or little windows of what's the definition of the person. They just said something like 0-point fluctuation energy or something. I have no idea what that is, but all of a sudden, quickly, because of the voice, the staff person gets it, collects among the individuals as well as the database, and very quickly you can have a screen coming up saying, here's 3 different definitions. You can also then have a screen coming up and saying, here's the current legislation about this. Another screen coming up and saying, here are the advantages of the idea. Another screen coming up, here's the disadvantages of the idea. Another screen coming up and saying, here are the unresolved or controversial issues. So the politician then looks at that screen and says, well, now, what do you think about the collaboration between Kyoto University and MIT on this research? Wow, politician sounds like he actually knows something. But the important thing is he gets the right questions. Dumb questions, brilliantly answered, are useless. So this is another version of collective intelligence. There'll be many other kinds coming up in the future. How to increase mental performance, short and long term. Now, many of you who have studied improving brain functioning and intelligence know that a lot of the things that you can do to improve it don't last very long. So I go, so what? Keep doing it. If you keep doing it, then you keep increasing your intelligence, or at least you improve your intelligence. So very quickly, here's some of the things that I would suggest are studied for human resources development of a corporation, of a country, of an individual, of a classroom, and even your own family. One is responding to feedback. Just getting the feedback is information overload. Responding to feedback closes the mental loop. Even if you don't respond well, you're more intelligent because you found out what your mistake was. So responding to feedback, very important. 2, consistency of love and diversity of environment. This is really important for children growing up. Think of it from the point of view of your brain. Why would your brain want to explore and think and ask the nervous system and the eyes and the mouth and the legs to move around to learn something new if it didn't feel love or didn't feel safe? It's hard to learn when you're in stress and not safe. The other is diversity of environment. That's why when little children are in cribs, we have all these weird things hanging off the crib for the children to play with. But keep changing those toys. Don't have the same ones for a month. Because if it's the same, then the brain goes, there's nothing new here, nothing to do. So consistency of love and diversity of environment. Now imagine applying that rule to management within an organization. Nutrition is an obvious one. But what we're going to be able to do more in the future is to self-diagnose your body at a given time of what you specifically need at this time. We're going to go to lunch, we're going to have all this together. But all of us will have slightly different nutritional needs. But we're acting as if we're all the same. Well, that's what we have today, not necessarily in the future. Reasoning exercises. We know there's such a thing as bodybuilding, right? We've got tons of these health clubs around the world, and everybody's bodybuilding and becoming healthy. Well, what about mind building? What are the mind building? Imagine having these fitness centers around the world for the body, and then having clunk right next to it the franchise for mind building. What would the reasoning exercises be? You remember all these little think tricks and Mensa, different little games that people play. Well, why not? Let's make them popular. Believing it's impossible, the placebo effect. People will say, you know, the placebo effect is when you're sick, and if you think you're going to get sicker, you get a little sicker. And if you think you're going to get better, it helps. So some people say, well, placebo effect is not worthwhile thinking about intelligence. But if you think you can become more intelligent, then you're going to do what? You're going to actually think it's possible and explore these things. If you don't think it's possible, you're not going to listen to anything I'm saying here. Right? So the placebo effect is important. Some people say it's only worth 10%. I'll take 10% increased intelligence. It would be okay. I'll settle for that. Contact with intelligent people. Now it's pretty hard. If intelligent people are the top 1 or 2%, it's hard for the rest of the world to do that. But in cyberspace, it's no problem. So everybody in the world eventually could have the experience of interacting with a multifaceted avatar of the highest IQ on the planet, of different kinds of IQs. We talk about emotional IQs, different kinds of IQs. Okay, so that we could all experience this. You know, we all, you know, there's an example where people copy, you know, we copy behavior, we copy things. Well, being near increased intelligence, we might start to copy some of that. It might actually affect the brain. Software systems and gaming. Korea is one of the leaders in gaming. And lo and behold, you got a pretty aggressive education system here and very alert people. So there's a correlation. People have said and have shown in lots of research that the gaming does in fact increase mental performance, but it's short term. So I go, so what? As I mentioned before, so what? So it does wear off in 6 months or so. So play some more games and bring it back up again. Neuropharmacology, this is the fastest way to improve brain function. We're learning a lot about how the brain reasons with chemistry, and we know that there's certain chemical combinations that make the brain focus better than not. Obviously, if you give me enough alcohol, I will not be able to focus well. We know these things. What's the other side of it? What are the kinds of chemical combinations that we should have to make our minds focus better? Memes, for some reason number 9 didn't show up on there, but memes is this idea of, it's a play on the word genes. So just as genes make up our DNA, memes make up our culture. What are those key ideas, key thoughts that are so simple that everybody understands them and it holds the culture together? Well, we might want to change those things. For example, we've got a feminine drain coming up in Korea, beginning already in Japan, and it's going to happen in Saudi Arabia. The feminine drain is the idea, feminine brain drain. Sorry, translators. What I mean by that is cultures that allow women to get PhDs, but then don't respect them enough in the marketplace, will eventually start losing the best and the brightest women. This is beginning in Japan. I have interns, many of those interns, they're Japanese. They end up staying. I would say that as a single cultural unit, Japanese women stay, in my experience, more in the United States than other particular groups that I have noticed. Saudi Arabia is going to go through the same thing. You can get a PhD in Saudi Arabia, but it's hard to get the same job. Take a look at the program for this whole conference. What percentage of men, what percentage of women? So be careful. You might lose your best and brightest women if you don't open up that workplace thing there. So you can have memes to change this. For example, intelligence is sexy, is a potential meme. Many women in the world don't believe they can get a good man if they're too bright, too intelligent. So they pretend not to be too smart. Well, that makes them not too smart. Right? So we change the meme to intelligence is sexy. So if we make that popular, all of a sudden you can be intelligent, you don't have to be embarrassed about being smart and reading books and things like that, and you can be sexy at the same time. Low stress stimulating environments, certain music and color and fragrances. I was in a conference in Paris a little while ago, and there's a manufacturer of all these perfumes. I said, you know, you're missing a whole market. You think it just goes in the human body. What fragrance makes the boardroom more efficient? Do you know? It's a whole new product line. What fragrance is the best in a factory? What kind of factory? Do we know? Maybe there's partnerships to be worked out with the perfume industry to improve performance. We all know that we feel good in certain situations that have certain color and light and scent and so forth. We know these things, but we should also integrate them into the work environment. In the long term, these are all short-term things that will make you smarter, but if you don't do them on a regular basis, you become dumb again. So what are the long-term ones? One is reverse engineer the brain and map it, and then figure out how to make it smarter. This is normal, just like in aviation and in car industries, different things. You get your competitor's project, you reverse engineer it, figure out how to, right? Okay, we'll do it with a brain. You know, maybe we can figure out how to reverse engineer Mr. Einstein's brain. Why is he so smart? You know, can I influence my brain that way? Another one is applied eugenics and genetic engineering. This is a longer term. These are things that make permanent change. A lot of controversy with this. But I think that one of the things that struck my mind, we did some global scenarios on these things, and one of the elements I had in the scenario was that people say that many countries say, don't mess with my genes. We want to outlaw cloning. We want to outlaw genetic changes of human personality and all that sort of stuff. Okay, fine. Now, what about a little country like Dominica? Small country in the Caribbean. They might say, hey, let's get this best bioengineer and this best software guy. Bring him down to my country, and we'll open up an IQ lab for genetic engineering. And mothers around the world start to hear, hey, I can make sure my baby is as smart as possible. And maybe I'll take a vacation down to Dominica, have a little genetic engineering, and then the word starts to get around. It's possible to have your child much more intelligent. How many women will sneak out to have their child more intelligent? I think more than one, more than 10, and it'll have a trend. So the idea of controlling this, I think, is about a 0% chance. And you don't want it to go underground because then you end up with maybe not very safe practices. Designer microbes, this is the one that this is my favorite one, because I'm getting a little older and I'd like not to get too senile. And so I'm up for creating some microbes that I can eat and then clean up the plaque in my brain. In any case, these are some long-term, but the idea here is that here's just a bunch of ideas in the year 2007. I'm willing to bet in the year 2010 that I will edit this list. I'll bet I'll edit it in 2011 or 12. So the point is, if it gets increasingly less costly and increasingly more possible to have the brains of all of us together a little more efficient, then we'll probably do it. We don't have time for all these. These are some long-term agenda questions for human development, human resources development to address. All 15 of these are important. It's a framework for understanding the human agenda. These 15 are listed in a linear way simply because that's the way we read. But it doesn't mean that number 1 is more important than number 15. Every single one of these challenges is important. And if improvements in one improves the others, regression in one affects the other. So it's a system. Right? It's like in the human body, we don't say the brain is more important than the stomach, especially before lunch. Anyway, we put all this information together for you in a State of the Future. You're welcome to get a hold of that. And there's a very famous Korean gentleman that thinks the report was pretty good. So in quick summary, here's just a couple of things I would leave with you just before lunch is 1, make increasing individual and collective intelligence a purpose of human resources development. 2, seek to increase mental stimulation while decreasing stress in the working environment. Increase employee opportunities to find synergies and contribute to the organizational collective intelligence. There should be a way for even the driver of the corporation to contribute new ideas. Because what does that driver do? He's driving the hotshots around all the time. He's hearing those conversations. He may have some interesting insights you may have missed. How do you tap that driver's intelligence? And he's going to feel good to the corporation because he's made a contribution. He's part of the family. Use simulations and virtual reality interfaces adapted to employees' unique needs throughout their careers. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, a motion picture is worth a lot more. Well, virtual reality is worth even much more. As many of you have tried to learn another language, doing it in a virtual reality environment of cultural artifacts makes the learning much faster. The prices for these things will come down enough. It's good. And once you've got good learning environments, virtual reality environments, you can have a lot of your employees use these things. Let's see. Create a futures intelligence system to anticipate new opportunities to improve human resources development. That's an obvious one I've been saying the whole time. Anticipate future needs to retrain older employees. People are going to live longer. They're going to increasingly, there's going to be breakthroughs coming up. So you don't have to do it right now, but start to think about if you started to keep older employees, how would they be periodically trained into new ways? Imagine that this is a whole new resource. They're not retiring off. They're not leaving. And one advantage of folks is they remember where the mistakes are. The younger folks may have all kinds of new ideas, bright and learning, but they don't know all the mistakes the older folks know. Assume conscious technology is a direction for human resources. So what is the human resource? The human resource is not just this thing and this brain. It is this thing interconnected with the entire world. I thank you very much.